Welcome to this session. The aim of the session is to have a really interactive conversation around funding renewables and resolving grid constraints in the context of the built environment, and in particular in the context of new build residential development. I will say a few words, introduce the company I work for, a company called SNRG, explain our perspectives on this particular topic and what we're doing about some of the challenges that exist in the space. And then what I would like to do is to bring the panel in. We've got some really amazing expertise and insights from practitioners across this space, so we can have an interactive discussion. And I would then like to invite you to raise questions if you have any, get involved in the conversation so we can really make the most out of the session. I will try not to spend too much time talking at the beginning so we can have a good Q&A. So just to introduce the panel to you, from left to right, we've got Chris Bailey, Technical Director at St Modwyn Homes. We've got, you might have to sort of wave or stand up. We've got Elizabeth Orchard, who is a master developer and independent consultant, but representing Ptarmigan land. We've got Aditi Tulpule, who is a legal expert and also works with SNRG with ourselves. She's our very own regulatory compliance expert. We've also got Rebecca Warren, also a lawyer, expert in planning development and works with Pinsent Mason. And finally, we've got Tom Veli, who works for LCP Delta, the energy consultancy, and Tom is head of networks. So hopefully we've got some interesting perspectives around the challenges and the solutions, and we can have a good discussion. So quickly, who am I? I'm Dan Nicholls. As I said, I work for SNRG. My background, I spent about 15 years working in really the agenda of local energy and focusing on how do we create sustainable development, decarbonise our environment, and do so in a way that doesn't place the burden on any particular actor within the sector, particularly developers, and also looks to capture some of the value of the decarbonisation agenda so that we can create enduring sustainable models. The good news for me was that 3 years ago I met the team at SNRG and joined the business. And what I liked about SNRG is we were taking those problems and really trying to solve them. So I'll talk a bit around that in a moment and explain how we do that. But for us and for me, it was very much about kind of going, having spent a number of years working on facilitating solutions, to actually be involved in having to try and walk the walk rather than just talk the talk was something that really appealed to me. So here we go. So I'll just take you through some slides around the topic. Let me just try and make sure I can do the clicker. So who are SNRG very quickly? So SNRG's a company that's really, the company's about 6 years old. We are owned by private equity and also by Centrica, the UK energy utility that owns British Gas, amongst other things. And we were set up really to try and tackle this problem I just talked about. Our mission is to try and decarbonise communities, and we fund, build, operate our solution. So through our private equity backing, we're able to bring fundings for our solution so we can deliver and operate something that doesn't impact developers and creates value for communities. We operate in industrial, commercial and residential, and we're all about trying to make sure we can deliver a new build environment that's fit for the future. So we've been around about 6 years, and in that process, we've been learning an awful lot, talking to a number of colleagues on the panel here, gaining a lot of experience and insight into this marketplace. And we can see clearly that the move away from dual fuel into net zero or sustainable homes is a significant challenge, and it introduces a number of particular problems for the development sector. And what we've learned is ultimately a model of pushing a policy agenda which says we must decarbonise isn't going to work, because what the move away from dual fuel to all electric does is it introduces a whole raft of new challenges that the whole sector has to get their head around. So what we are seeing in terms of the issues in the marketplace is, obviously the first one is increased cost. So if we're going to ask developers to install renewables, for example, put in heat pumps, add electric vehicles to housing estates, clearly that's extra capex. That's more cost that the market's got to consume and handle. And of course, within that, there's an element of complexity there as well, moving away from traditional dual fuel, where the segment is pretty well understood, risks are quite well managed, costs are quite well understood, to a segment where we're adding new technologies. Those technologies are evolving and improving, and therefore complex as well as costly. And the other kind of thing we've noticed within the marketplace is that there's some significant impacts on development viability, and there's two particular areas that we've really noticed. One is essentially grid constraint. So moving from dual fuel to all electric, not only does it add cost and complexity, it increases the peak demand on the grid for electrical power, and that's creating enormous problems across the sector, because what it's therefore doing is triggering more demand on the distribution network, creating constraints, and those constraints are turning into either cost allocations, so developments have got to bear more cost, or delays in terms of securing capacity, and that has a wider economic impact. It's not just about the cost of developing new homes. So we're seeing that moving to all electric is adding to the challenges that developments face. And we're also, when you dig deeper, you're seeing that it's also starting to disrupt the model, the delivery model. So again, the typical model with a dual fuel solution is that you would, from an infrastructure point of view, you've got to put gas, you've got to put water in. You would typically reach out to either a distribution network operator, a gas distributor, a water operator, or an independent, and they would come along, and if it was an independent, you could expect to receive a reasonable contribution from that independent to adopt those assets. Therefore, we're in a position where you've got reasonable recovery of costs to provide infrastructure. Obviously, moving away from gas, you've lost that revenue stream as a developer. Moving to all electric and then starting to add solar panels, things like battery storage and so on, you're starting to impact the electrical revenue stream too. So it's not just about grid constraint, it's not just about capital cost of infrastructure, it's also about development viability from the point of view of funding the infrastructure that we need. So we've seen those kind of three areas of challenge that are kind of fundamentally impacting development viability. And we have developed a product that we call a smart grid, which is our offering to try and solve some of those problems. So what our smart grid does, very briefly, is through our financial backing, we're able to fund the installation of renewables. We can do so in a way that cuts the grid connection costs, because a smart grid manages the distribution of demand and generation across the scheme, and therefore reduces the impact on the distribution network network operator. And importantly, the smart grid product also then allows us to offer long-term savings for residents. So I think this is a key part of this decarbonisation journey. If we're going to be successful, we need to be able to tackle the viability problems for development. We need to deal with grid constraints, and we also need to deal with residents and energy consumers. You can't decarbonise if it's going to cost people substantially more. So we really focused on those three areas. So this is a very brief explanation. I'll keep it quite high level of the smart grid. How does it work essentially? Well, it's a communal solution. That's the first thing to say. We install and fund solar across a housing development, but all of that solar is a communal resource. It all supplies power into a single communal battery solution. And we have our software-based control system that allows us then to balance the loads across the site. So that essentially is our offering. We adopt the network, so we act as a distributor. We use the renewables to provide power to residents, so we act as a supplier. And through doing that, we're able to ensure that there's a lifetime saving for residents. And of course, we can balance the peaks and troughs in supply and demand, which helps with the network. And finally, excuse me, hopefully that cough is not going to carry on. That'll be my call to hand over the microphone. So, and finally, the operating model that we've developed allows residents to have a stake, which is important. We think that idea of community involvement in these solutions being done with rather than done to is an important part of the model. And it can create long-term revenue streams. So it also allows us to talk to key stakeholders, landowners, particularly those with a long-term interest in the development, local authorities, for example, about co-investing with us to deliver these benefits and creating long-term revenue streams. So that is the smart grid. We think that mindset is about taking problems and turning them into opportunities. There's plenty within that we'd like to unpick. I'd like to stop talking and invite the panel to talk about some of these topics, their perspectives, issues they experienced, go into some more detail, their observations on some of the models, not just our model. So with that in mind, other than saying that SNRG are available within the Royal Armouries Hall on stand K50, if you'd like to come and talk to us, I will introduce the panel and we will start the Q&A. So, firstly, I'd like to introduce Chris. Chris worked for Tate Modern Homes. Chris will say a bit about himself, but I'd also like to get Chris's perspective as a developer of sustainable homes, looking at the marketplace, moving away potentially from dual fuel to deliver all electric homes. The assumption is that if we create sustainable homes, it's a good thing. We're going to decarbonise our environment. We're going to create homes that are cheaper to run, that are smarter, etc., greener. Surely that's a good product. The market is going to lap that up. I'd just like Chris to sort of share some thoughts on some of the nuances and some of the challenges that he's experiencing in the marketplace, because clearly we know it's not a perfect world. We know there's a lot more to this than just making those assumptions. Chris.
Thanks, Dan. Can you hear me? Good. So Modwin Homes, for those that don't know us, we're a medium-ish size house builder. We build around 1,200 houses a year at the moment. But we're also an organisation that has kind of poked at the boundaries of what we can do in terms of sustainable housing. We currently have projects with SNRG using smart grids. We're working on a project with Octopus with their zero bill scheme, as well as doing carbon negative houses of our own. I should qualify that the vast majority of what we do is still dual fuel gas heated houses, but if we think something's got legs, we don't hesitate to give it a go. Going back to the question, Dan asked, is this a good thing? I think anybody in the room would say it's a good thing. I probably would just go a little bit further than that and say, this is essential that we do this as a country. If we're going to stand any chance of limiting global warming to a tolerable level, it's something that has to be done. But I would also agree with Dan that it is not simple. Delivering at scale is not simple. We've got the technological solutions. The task for the industry is how we fund it without affecting viability. Now, we've been, as I said, trying various things with this. And we're on the journey, like all of us. But just taking it from a developer and from a customer point of view, from a house buying public point of view, thought I'd make a couple of points that just share our experience with doing it. The first thing I would say is around demand. Every time we do one of these schemes, we see huge demand. People want this. There is, the conventional wisdom of when you buy a house, it's location, location, location. I don't think that has changed, but sustainability is definitely in there. People want it. Different reasons why they want it, but the demand is definitely there. However, and this is the big but, they don't want to pay for it. There are people out there that believe that, you build a house with low bills, people will pay 20, 30, 40,000 pounds more. That is not our experience as a developer. And I think you have to look at it in the context of the progression that a standard new build has made over the last few years. If you build a standard 2-3 bed semi-detached house, your combined energy bill, regulated and unregulated, is going to be about £600-700 a year. It's not that expensive to run. So any premium that you're looking to charge for a super efficient house, you have to consider as a multiplier of that. Are you willing to add 20 grand on your mortgage, which is going to cost you 40 grand over the life of a mortgage, to save 750 quid a year? You don't need to be a genius to work that out. It doesn't work. So I would suggest, from our experience, the premium people are willing to pay for a more sustainable house really is limited to 5 grand for a typical semi-detached house, say. That talks to what Dan was saying about, so how do we do this without, delivering viability challenges. And that's how you obviously need to get investment in. And that's where the synergy model really works for us. It provides a way of leveraging third-party capital into the development, enabling us to install those technologies, which we all know how to do, without adversely affecting the build costs. The second bit, which Dan has already alluded to, is around running costs. And this, for me, has always been the elephant in the room with decarbonising. And somewhere where I think there's a real education for everybody. People talk about efficiency, not necessarily whether it's carbon efficiency or cost efficiency. And there is a huge, huge difference. Everybody knows that heat pumps are the option. You know, that's where we're all going to be in 18 months' time. But you say to a customer, you know, this heat pump is 3 times more efficient than a gas boiler. They assume it's going to be a third of the cost. And that's just not the case. You know, whilst the heat pump is 3 times more efficient than a gas boiler, a kilowatt of electricity is 3 to 4 times the price of a kilowatt of gas. And that is the real challenge that we have to face into as an industry in decarbonising. So, what's the answer? Obviously, PV and storage is part of the mix, but that costs capital. So, really, the smart thinking now is around how do you get that capital into the scheme. Synergy is one option. There are plenty others out there. There's a very emerging market about how you fund and then recoup that over the lifetime of the scheme. And I will leave the others of the panel to talk a bit more about that, because I think they're probably better placed than me.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, and we'll invite people to comment on that as we go. But just to sort of pick up on the point around the heat pumps and to get through kind of some of the content issues we've seen, I think the other thing about the heat pumps obviously is when you're replacing heat pumps, gas boilers with heat pumps, you've got that additional demand as well, which is another factor in terms of the development economics, is the cost of connecting to the grid. You know, it's a multifaceted challenge, and I just wanted to introduce Tom into that area. Tom was an expert in terms of grid management at LCP Delta. Just wonder if you might talk a bit more about that issue with the grid constraint and how that might be affecting developments.
Yeah, absolutely. So, afternoon, everyone. Tom Veli, LCP Delta. So I've been working with gas and electricity distribution networks for over a decade now. I remember when EVs were not potentially going to be an option, and 10 years ago there was an innovation project called Electric Nation, and now EVs are very much part of the agenda. Similarly with heat pumps, we're seeing something similar now with smart grids and energy communities. So distribution networks, the electricity distribution networks and transmission networks. So the guys that deliver electricity to your doors are extremely interested in this space. So if I just sort of set the scene slightly on the challenge we have. So the net zero 10-point plan that was released by government, we're planning to quadruple renewables generation, so huge amounts of wind. We're also going to have up to triple our energy demand. So we've got a huge amount of renewables coming onto the grid, we've got a huge amount of demand, and it's about marrying that up. And the thing that sometimes people forget about are renewables are wonderful things, but a lot of the time you don't need electricity when it's sunny or when it's windy. So having a solution like Synergy has is a great mechanism for that, for balancing. So one of the big challenges that organisations, particularly developers, have is the connection. And distribution networks are, I think most people are aware, do not accept risk at all. They don't take any risk, so they're always very careful of that. They've got 3 huge fundamental challenges in this space, and this is part of their risk management exercise. One is congestion challenges and capacity. One is resilience. So There's a huge amount of work going on at the moment around resilience as a service, and this is a huge concern for government as well. And this is something for people to be aware of, that resilience for vulnerable customers is critical for day to day, but for everyone that's going to have electric, heat, and electric vehicles, they also become vulnerable to a certain extent. So there's a huge concern for distribution networks around that. Final one is balancing. So we're starting to see a huge amount of capacity constraint on the network. Dan's mentioned heat pumps, similarly of EVs. We're talking about tripling demand here. So there's a huge amount of management around that. So distribution networks see what SNRG are doing and others are doing, that a virtual power plant, which is what SNRG is offering in a microgrid solution, where there's this huge demand, it's almost a lever for the grid. So at the moment, we've got this huge amount of wind renewable coming south from Scotland. Now, we need a balancing mechanism for that. And one thing that the distribution networks are really interested in is how the likes of Dan and SNRG can support, both from a resilience point of view, a congestion point of view, a capacity point of view, and a balancing mechanism. We're going to start to see the energy system, not just locally, but whole system. We're moving away from this sort of centralised system to more localised systems. We're going to be decentralised. Therefore, we need solutions like this. I'm going to finish on a couple of things that have happened recently with networks to sort of show their commitment to this space. In the last 24 months, there's been 2 large demonstration projects where they've invested £50 million on field trials. So they've really got an appetite for this space. They really see the benefit, which could relieve connection issues that we're currently seeing. One of which is community DSO, and where a microgrid can actually participate directly with the DSO, so that we're directly with the distribution network. So there are revenue streams to be had, not just with the consumer and making sure their bills are as low as possible, but there's also money to be made by working with the distribution network, and that money can actually flow down to SNRG to ultimately the customer. And I'll leave it there, Dan.
Brilliant, Tom. Thank you. I mean, I think what this just highlights is just if we can't talk about decarbonising the houses that we're building just by focusing on the houses, that's the key thing. We need to think about all of these factors that interplay. And one other complexity that we learned quite early as a business is you can't also just be talking to house builders, because the way that sites are brought forward through the process, there are multiple stakeholders. And one really key stakeholder in this whole piece is the master developer. So in a large site, when you're seeing a master developer bringing forward and servicing the scheme, then potentially bringing house builders onto the site to build the houses, that's another key part of this process. And if the solutions don't work for the house builder, then, the master developer, then it's still not going to work. So I just was keen to bring Elizabeth in as a master developer to get some thoughts on some of those issues and some of the models she's seeing in the marketplace.
Thanks, Dan. So I'm Elizabeth Orchard. I'm an independent consultant, and my business is Endelevu Limited. I'm a retained consultant by Ptarmigan Land, who are a strategic land promoter, and I define myself as a strategic land master developer. I'm one of the UK's leading experts in delivering sustainable development on large sites, and I've worked internationally on all sorts of projects. So for me, it doesn't matter what's ultimately being built on a site. For me, it's all about the infrastructure and servicing that land for what's needed then to facilitate the next step in development. So picking up on the question that's just asked there about the challenges for the master developer, ultimately the way that the master developer funds the infrastructure is sometimes through private investment. So you get an initial cash outlay from someone to fund building a road or whatever, and you recover that through land sales. The alternative is that the infrastructure will pay for itself, and that's the other way of recouping the initial investor money. Now, the challenge with the current smart grid arrangement is it becomes a private wire network. So the limitations at the moment for the grid as a whole is that it requires the two-way flow. If you want to put any sort of generating technology onto your grid, as Tom outlined very eloquently there, we're generating electricity from solar and wind at the times we don't need it. So that means you've got not many people using it, and all of that electricity has to fit down those wires at the same time. And there's nowhere for it to go, really, because no one's actually using it. So batteries are a really neat solution to that. But at the moment, because the grid is risk averse and it doesn't want to take on other people's tech that it's not in control of, it's not really a viable solution to have that as part of the grid network itself. So they ask us to put that behind a gate, essentially, the private wire network. What that means then is when we've got the independent distribution network operators, which you will hear has spoken of IDNOs, and I know we've got some of those in the room, they will not give the same asset value contributions, or AVCs, to the master developers or the house builders if they're behind a private wire network. They're then treated as a commercial connection, which has a lot lower level of value associated with that asset. So we take, as master developer, a massive hit, and we're talking 85% of the capital asset value cash hit when we then install a smart grid. So that's why there's not a great uptake. We're also planning sites that are going to be delivered over the next 10 to 30 years. So what I'm designing for today will not see the ground for another 10, 20, 30 years. So how do we create resilient networks, energy networks within our sites for technology that doesn't exist? Think about what's happened in the UK energy market in the last 10, 20, 30 years. It has totally changed. I mean, 30 years ago, would we have said, oh, there'll be no gas in 30 years? Well, no, we probably wouldn't have done. We wouldn't have been designing for all electric. There'd be something else coming forward. So we have to think about this holistically and go, how do we put all those things together? How do we get that cash injection back in to fund the infrastructure in the first place? And we have to look for that cash coming back in different ways. So taking the hit up front on the initial asset value contribution is not always an option. Do we secure more investment up front to kind of push out some of the pain of building this infrastructure? Do we work with partners like SNRG, who will give a top up on the asset value contribution because they know they get that back later down the line because they've got a great network behind the private wire, and they'll get the capital later. They're more patient. So those solutions are still evolving. Ultimately, the lack of battery storage is what stopped smart grids coming forward 20 years ago. I first started researching in this field 15, 20 years ago. And back then, all the tech's been viable forever. I mean, in Europe, we're 20 years behind in the UK compared with what's happening in Europe, partly because of how slow we've been in interconnecting within our regions. So the tech's there, it's all proven, it's very well established, particularly overseas, less so in the UK market. But it's all there and ready to go. It's just actually piecing the puzzle together. So that's currently what Dan and I are working on one of my projects, is actually how do we get at a strategic level the sites to be viable from day one, and actually allow the master developer to kind of set the bar. Robin Hood is walking by outside. Sorry, I just got completely distracted. You're all going to turn around now. It's very hard to concentrate when you've got that walking by. So hopefully that answers your question, Dan.
Well, I mean, what it highlights is the complexity of the challenge, right? That's the key thing here, and you've got to think about the cash flow for the infrastructure. So it is no good thinking about just kind of putting solar panels on roof. And, you know, obviously the point that Elizabeth also raises is that you start to put solar panels on roofs of homes, you start to reduce the requirement for power from the grid, which starts to disrupt some of the traditional models that we've got. And, you know, I think to tackle these problems, we need to kind of look at it all and around, which is absolutely key. So, and another area for me that's actually really dear to my heart is also the community and the energy consumer. So we can look at the kind of infrastructure, we look at the network, we can look at the commercial and developer the market. What we can't avoid is also looking at residents and people that are going to live in those buildings. And for me, you know, there's no point building houses if we're not making places. So the long-term stewardship is also another key element of this jigsaw puzzle. And that brings me on to Rebecca. who at Pinsent Mason is working on a lot of big projects dealing with this particular issue, and I'd be really keen to get a bit of perspective from Rebecca on how its stewardship and asset operation, adoption, maintenance, sustainability is maintained as we move into this new high-tech, low-carbon world.
Thanks, Dan. So yes, Rebecca Warren at Pinsent Masons. So I'm a planning and property specialist, and I've had the benefit of working with Elizabeth and others in the room here on the developer side, not as a lawyer. And so I come at it from a slightly different perspective than many colleagues in the industry. But my particular passion is building of communities and placemaking, which is what has led me throughout my career, particularly in the developer choices where I chose to work. And as Dan said, community is really important. So we talked a lot about technical aspects, but we need to think about the people who are going to be in those places and using that technology and the ease of use of that technology. But also, how do we make these places viable and vibrant? Well, many of you may own your own homes or know people who do, and some of you may even be living on estates and new communities where you pay a service charge for the benefit of the maintenance and management of various pieces of infrastructure, whether that be green, blue, or whatever. And there's been a big debate, and it's a political hot potato, a bit like the ground rent saga for the last few years, about the level and affordability of those service charges. And the Commissioner Markets Authority reported earlier this year, and they were very scathing about how the development industry have gone about managing the assets and the cost of that, and the lack of involvement and say that the community have. So I particularly liked what Dan said earlier about he's very interested in making sure that the community are done with and not to. And I think that's really an important thing when we're looking at any new technology and however we structure our new communities. So one of the things that I'm particularly working on the stewardship piece is how we can use new technologies, in fact old existing assets in some respects, and things we've been doing for years, but leveraging them in a way that it's beneficial to the community. And the way we've been talking today, this particular technology, we can get the community involved through structures that they actually partially have ownership. The community vehicle partly owns the JV arrangement with SNRG or other providers. And they get a shareholding return, not the individuals, but the community gets a shareholding return. And that can help offset their service charge and make it more affordable. So when you're taking a scheme through planning, many politicians I've had to discuss and explain how things work. And they are desperate for PV panels. They don't really understand much of the technology, but they're also mindful of their voting public and the fact of the hardship that many people are going through, and obviously the energy crisis of the last couple of years has been particularly challenging. So to be able to offset somebody's service charge level is particularly powerful when you're taking a scheme through planning. So I'm going to hold off for there now, because I know there's an awful lot we can unpack on that subject, and I can wax lyrical. Please catch me afterwards if you want to understand about the actual structures in a bit more detail. But for that, I think that's it for now, Dan.
Thank you, Rebecca. Brilliant. So, I mean, so having been through all of this, and I'm sure there are people in the room listening to this and going, okay, there's quite a lot to this big picture. I guess that's part of my message. We need to join all of those points up to find the solution, and that's something that SNRG is really focused on as a provider of solution in the marketplace. I mean, Chris and St. Modburn, I think, could have the right approach. They're saying this is an inevitable thing that we have to do. We need to make it work. But given the challenges that developers are facing, I wouldn't be at all surprised if secretly some house builders secretly wish they could pick the phone up to the gas company and say, can I just still keep putting gas in, please? Because of the complexity. And one of the areas of complexity is the regulations. Elizabeth hinted at it. Rebecca's talking about how you structure entities to sustain over time. And obviously Tom talked about grid, and a heavily regulated area. Grid regulations are not joined up to house building regulations, not joined up to building regulations, etc. Now, Aditi, I'd like to bring Aditi in. I'd just like to get some thoughts from Aditi about how we can, some of the regulatory challenges that house builders and developers and the community are we faced with as we decarbonise, but also maybe comment on some of the potential opportunities to simplify and deliver solutions.
Thanks, Anand. So, yeah, absolutely. Look, I'm a regulatory lawyer, and yes, we all hate regulation, but the truth be told, we need it. There's no question about it. It's protected consumers. The reason why we don't need to know what the terms and conditions of our supply are is because we know we're protected as consumers. We know it's going to be fair. And I think we can't lose that. So the key point I think that needs to be made here is you don't want to change everything. There is stuff that's working and you want to retain it. And I think that's the point, in that what Synergy are bringing to the table now, and I'm talking about Synergy because I work there, but I'm pretty sure there'll be other variations of the theme, is to not change things that are working and actually only change things that are not working. So what is it that's not working? We've got grid infrastructure that's in the ground since the 1800s. It was designed for unidirectional flows, big ticket generation, baseload power, essentially, which is predictable power, nuclear, coal, whatever it might be. That's flowing down from big stations and then slowly being unwound, or they call it windings anyway, correct me if I'm wrong, the technos in the pavilion. But essentially they're winding down to the point where it comes down to about 11 kV and you connect into your household. Now, this is an old network. We've now suddenly got wind farms, solar panels, that are all what are referred to as intermittent or unpredictable generation. And they're no longer connected at the top, which is where nuclear power stations are, to the transmission network. We're connecting it to the distribution network. We've now got individual homeowners that have PV on their rooftops. They're not consumers anymore, they're prosumers. So we're really asking this old grid to perform new tricks. Some things that haven't changed for 100 years, we want to change in 5 years and expect it to behave. And quite frankly, a kudos from me to everybody that's actually within this network at this point in time, the transmission network operators, the distribution network companies, the ESO, for doing a fantastic job for managing this transition. They haven't done everything right, fair enough, but it's been a hard task for them. And I think the point is the story's now shifted. They've done what they could do, they're doing what they can do, but it is a transition. It's got to move to a new era. And that's the point I'm going to try and make today, because we have a network, that's now effectively dysfunctional. We need it to be supported by private investment, and the solution is actually in the last mile of the network. That's where the consumers live, and that's where the generators are increasingly living, which then means you've now got local power. Our industry in the UK is unbundled. We've basically distinguished distribution from supply, from generation, for very, very good reasons. But now I think it's time to rethink that. We do need generation, distribution, and supply that is local to essentially make it most effective as a solution. Power physically flows naturally to the closest point of demand. That's just the reality. We've commercially changed that to make things referred to as grid standard. We have no concept of community anymore in regulation, and that has to be brought forward. Now, until all of that happens, what's the solution? Because things are moving fast. And I think what needs to happen is community-based solutions. We're talking place-based power. We're talking about generation which is local to demand, and therefore therefore distribution that's able to balance that demand. Now, what does that actually mean for developers? It means you don't necessarily need to go out for expensive capacity from grid that's already crumbling, quite frankly, from the demand that's being put on it. I mean, a couple of the developers we spoke to said, well, we went to the grid for a connection for our scheme, and we came back with a quote of £27 million and a connection date for 2037. That is a problem. And and quite frankly, it's unfortunately not going to be uncommon anymore as we go forwards. I mean, just in the BBC today, there was a news article that said purely data centers that are furnishing or servicing AI have the potential to break the grid's back. That's how critical this problem is. And therefore, the solution has to be local power, local distribution, and local generation. And yes, regulation is difficult, but necessary. And therefore, yes, it places a high threshold for having models that actually work, but they're not impossible. I think it's important that we recognize that we all need to be on a journey. Business as usual is not working, and we have to find a solution that is fair to all. And I think that's where the future is. Thanks, Dan. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, DC. Thank you, DC. I think collectively, the whole kind of summary of this session really is to try and highlight the fact that it's a multi-complex problem. It's something that SNRG has spent the last 3 to 4 years really focusing on building a business model to try and solve some of those problems. And we're obviously keen and here to work with the market to deliver solutions. But we need to continue to work together. We need network expertise and regulatory expertise. We need to think about placemaking. We obviously need to think about development, economics and infrastructure. So all of those things need to come together if we're going to decarbonise and deliver sustainable communities. So the aim of the panel was to kind of bring up some of those topics of conversation. I'd like to hear what you think and any questions that you have. So we've got a few minutes of opportunity to ask questions and also feel free to sort of postulate some opinions as well whilst you're in the subject. Yes.
Hi, I'll postulate an opinion. It's Barney Evans from Turdy. There's obviously a lot of smart stuff going on, and we work on developments which are almost all major new developments now all electric, so they're sort of factoring in heat pumps and EV charging. And what we're seeing on the grid connection is some very high assumptions about the ADMD, as it's called, the average connection, so sort of 4.5, 6 kVA per home. But it seems to us as evidence that you really don't need more than about 2 or 3 max, and therefore the grid actually has a lot more capacity than we think, but we're not using it. So I just wondered what the panel thought. Am I right? Are we going to get round this? That was my question.
Dan, can I jump in on this one? Because this is exactly what I'm looking at the moment. So I agree with you 100%, and bless them, they're in the room. My utility, he's just walked out, that's good. My utility consultants are always saying, oh, you need to allow this much. Now, experience, and I speak a lot because I'm able to as a kind of semi-independent. I speak a lot to IDNOs, to the DNOs, to the transmission network operators themselves, and what we've seen, so post-COVID, something really cool happened, and there's loads of open source data now. So that means, being the nosy bugger that I am, I can go and I can take so I'm a chartered civil engineer, so I know absolutely nothing about electricity, which is perfect to ask all the really annoying questions that people have kind of gone, oh, that's too difficult. Exactly that. I've looked at the open source data and said, hang on a second, you've got 30% headroom on the network, but you're saying you've got no energy. Where the heck is that 30% sitting? So I've carried on digging and I found it. And what's been happening is that the pesky master developers like myself, having been told for the last 20 years that energy demand is only going to go up, have procured more energy than we needed to, which is where those AMD, whatever the letters are, the demand for the development calculations massively overestimate actual usage. And what should have been happening is when the development's complete, the surplus energy should be sold back to the grid. And you do get a rebate, so that kind of end of the project, want a bit of cash back, probably going to be pure profit because you'd forgotten about it at that point. Cash back injected into your project to release electricity back onto the grid that was, frankly, it was there anyway. It's only hypothetical at this point. And that then is available for the next development. So I've got a project down in Chelmsford at the moment that we were told this is the £30 million to connect 6,500 homes in 2 years' time. Don't work for me. I own, as Ptarmigan, we own 1,500 of those units, and we want to build them preferably from the end of this year, and we'd quite like to connect them from the end of this year. Thanks very much. And I'd like some money back to help fund my infrastructure. Thanks very much. So talking directly with the DNO, working with SNRG, working with the IDNO, we have discovered that actually one of our previous phases of the development has, funnily enough, 30% capacity available at the end of the project because they'd over-purchased, which we have already paid for, so we don't need to give it back, we just plug it in. That has worked out nicely for us geographically, so that gives us about 1 megawatt of power that gives us our first couple of years. So the grid reinforcement can go on because we're liaising early, so we're not speculative development. So my costs have gone, our share was about £5.5 million, have gone down to £100,000 for the grid connection. Because we're not speculative development, we've got our first couple of hundred units, to get us to the next stage while the grid merrily update themselves and then we get our next power load through. Add on a private wire network, our overall consumption has come down 20 to 30%, on top of the 30% that's being released from previous phases, and all of a sudden there's a bit more juice in the network. So yes, we do have an emerging energy crisis, but it's not quite as bad as it looks, because there is currently, we're operating on the national grid at around 30% headroom.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I mean, I think this kind of brings up one other point in this. I think not taking no for an answer is also part of the solution, just to
For sure.
reflect on that. And I think people like you, Barney, bringing forward insights and evidence at the marketplace, I think this is an emerging a topic for DNOs as well, in terms of understanding the data, moving to all electric and so on. But I'd just like to bring in Tom and Aditi to comment as well from their perspectives. Tom, you can go first.
So I've been involved in that space a lot about heat pumps and EVs and the sort of the capacity management and the methodology behind that, and how they sort of assess your EV and your heat pump and the maximum demand, and they'll always the distribution network will always push for the maximum, and it's purely down to risk methodology. Yeah, they are. I mean, the evolution of what's happened on the electrification of heat, power and transport over the last 10 years has been huge, and they're not ready for that. There's not enough data. They don't understand it enough to be that sure they need those guarantees that those LCTs that you're talking about will not hit their max capacity. So if you look at their sort of 5-year business plans, they take that exact approach. So they'll go, right, okay, well, this is the network and these are the homes and they're all going to hit this maximum capacity. You know, we have to, although that's not going to happen, we have to take that because there's not enough assurance for that. However, there are changes happening. There's going to be changes in the next REOED3 period for networks. So you'll start to see how they forecast demand will be different. They'll take a more probabilistic forecasting approach rather than just taking, right, this heat pump at its max is going to, demand this. EV at max is going to add this. Add those together, that's what it's going to be. It's actually going to be a lot less than that. So you'll start to see changes in that going forward. So the methodology is wrong. It's out of date. It hasn't changed. But they need data and they need validation, which is what they're getting now, but it's just taking time. And unfortunately, this will all feed into REOED3, which will start in 2028 for the 5 years after that. So.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say it is actually quite right. It's a regulatory requirement. And is it outdated? Yes. Like a lot of regulatory provisions, the heart's in the right place, but I think the how it needs to be delivered has to change. This is one of those things. The other thing I just wanted to go back actually and say, I think the release of capacities probably work because you've been in the same DNO territory, so the same GSP group. And then the second reason is you've potentially got load control. Now, load control is geography agnostic as long as it's across a certain section of the behind the meter outlay. So, for example, for an entire development, load control is possible regardless of whether the development is in the same GSP group as another development you've got. The release of capacity from one side to the other is a harder battle to fight unless you're in the same DNO group. So, and within the same constraints. So you can have a DNO, so I think SSC's got 2 regions. So it's got to be in the same region. That's the point. Long story short, absolutely agree with Tom. I think the regulation will change in time as it must. The first layer is already in place where Ofgem's required, or DESNZ is now requiring that data be openly available. So there's OpenAI, there's everybody literally within the physical chain of and the commercial chain of balancing and settlement now has data available. So I know Elexons, for example, the BMRS system is no longer functional. They've now moved on to another system and platform, which actually makes that data available from a settlement perspective. Same thing with the DNOs through the Flex project. So, for example, you've got data available. That's stage 1. Stage 2 is then kind of understanding just where exactly that flex lies, and then allowing that flex to essentially be effective from the price control mechanism. So yes, happening, but time yet.
Thank you, Barney.
Working? Can you hear me? Sorry, Leah Holmes from Hydrock, now Stantec. Hello, Dan. We worked together a little bit on this topic specifically. I've got two questions, if I can be selfish. So one of them, going back to the operation, maintenance, stewardship. I work with master developers and house builders. The big question that we get around this, which I can't answer at the minute, but you might be able to, is who is then responsible for maintaining in the long term? And I'm talking, these developments hopefully are sustainable for 40, 50, 60 years. We've all got solar panels on our roofs. Who is responsible for maintaining those, replacing those, operating those? If it's a, community-based smart microgrid, those are the sorts of questions that I'm getting from like a master developer who needs to explain that to the house builders that want to buy these houses that are done in a different way.
So the short answer to the question directed at Synergy is Synergy will provide that service. The more generic and perhaps the more interesting question is ultimately what you need to be able to provide these solutions is an operating model that's self-sustaining. So that's really where we focused our attention and where these solutions need to focus their attention. You need to be able to create revenue to refund the capital that's been invested, to also deal with the operational cost and the maintenance. If you can do that, you can create a genuinely sustainable model, and that model can be built into the community using the stewardship models that Rebecca talks about, and therefore it can sustain, it can persist, and it can renew. And then ultimately, again, from our perspective, the more we can get the community involved in that, without necessarily taking risk or liability, the more we can create models that work for placemaking. I don't know if Aditi or Rebecca wish to add to that, but that's essentially how we tackle.
Yes, so I mean, in terms of long term, the Synergy model, forgive me, Dan, I think it's 30 years. Thereafter, do you want to? I'll pass over. But ultimately, the thing with most people is that they like the benefits, they don't want the risk, and that's human nature. So I'm looking at purely from my grandmother, right? So she builds it. She goes into a new house. Can she operate it? And who does she have to call if something goes wrong? Most people don't understand things. I've got an air source heat pump, I've got solar panels, and it took me time, and I actually quite educated in understanding it just to make it balance and work. So for most lay people, you need to make it easy. And maintenance is the one thing that people hate to deal with. One, it's the time and hassle, and two, it's the cost, the unknown costs. So not only do people have a reduction in their overall energy costs, but they also don't have the hassle and the maintenance for 30 years or however long it may be. So I think for most people, they're not going to live in a house 30 years, if we're honest. Most people generally move every 5 to 10 years, and that's what hence second-hand market. So ultimately, as we're pushing through, things will change and the grid will green up. So in 30 years, quite frankly, we will not be having conversations like this, one hopes. Aditi, do you want to?
And I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about the Synergy model to try and answer your question quite directly. There will be other models there. But I think the key thing from our perspective is that the assets, the key question here is who owns the assets. When you talk about who's maintaining them, well, who's owning them? That's the first question. And I think in the Synergy setup, we want to put the ownership of the assets that are used for distribution. We've made a distinction between distribution assets and generation assets. And the reason for that is generation assets require replacement in 15, 20 years, and technology could change. So you don't want to kind of create a structure which traps consumers into a system where, it's not working anymore. But at the same time, distribution assets are the more expensive assets, but they're in the ground and they live for 100 years. So naturally, the investment case for those is different. And the important bit is that the community needs to own the distribution structure. That should not be in private ownership. We strongly believe that at Synergy, because that's where the risk is. If you have a blackout, it's not because your solar panel's not working. It's because your transformer or your cable in the ground isn't working. So that essentially that risk needs to be hedged for the consumers. There should be no risk to the consumer on that basis at all. And that's what the synergy model does, is it allows the community as a whole, not individuals, as a whole, to actually own the infrastructure. The generation infrastructure is essentially, because the assets are funded in the synergy equation, synergy takes the risk, and we're incentivized to actually make sure that they perform, because if it doesn't perform, we don't get money. So we're heavily incentivized. So in terms of O&M, all of the assets, the O&M will be provided by Synergy, but as subcontractor arrangements. Because nothing here, we're not breaking new ground in terms of actually physical infrastructure. There have been cables in the ground for ages, and DNOs maintain them. That's exactly the same in this setup as well. Solar panels on the rooftop, nothing new there. Battery connected, nothing new there either anymore. Used to be 10 years ago, not anymore. So, the O&M aspect is well and truly covered in the Synergy solution anyway. Thank you.
And can I pick up on this as the master developer? So the way to sell it, really, is to hit what the master developers are looking at. So they're talking in terms of that cash flow. So they're putting in the infrastructure up front. When do they see that ROI? And that's really where they've got to drill down on it. So yes, O&M is important, but it's also the question of as they're designing it, actually, is there going to be a new way of thinking? Do they have to do anything differently as master developer? And that will always be intimidating. I'm a crazy person. I love change, and it excites me. Not everyone's like that. They want an easy life and just what's the simple solution. The beauty of something like the Synergy solution is it is simple for the master developer, and it's also very resilient. So my critique at the moment of the individual housing unit solutions is that they're not very resilient, because if that technology changes, you've got X number of houses that you have to change all the technology in. When you've got a smart grid solution, and what we're doing here is co-locating batteries next to your substations that you've already got on site. So we're very good at building brick housing, and someone comes along and puts the substation in it. Do that again, and this time they'll put batteries in it. Or you can do two-storey ones, so you don't lose any developable area, which obviously master developers will care about as well, because that's where the value is, in the land. And that's resilient, because if you've got just a brick shell, you can come and you can change that technology. They've been doing that with transformers for years. Your transformer ages out. What does the master developer do when your transformers age out? They don't care, they've gone. What happens at the moment is whoever owns the transformer comes along and replaces the transformer. They take the lid off the substation, they open the doors, they take it out and they put a new one in. That's what will happen with the batteries on the smart grid. They'll come along later, they'll take the batteries out, they'll put new ones in. The solar panels are on the outside of the house. So relatively unobtrusive, not disruptive to the people living inside to come and have that replaced at the end of its usable life. And the technology will evolve and they'll get lighter and cheaper and everything else. And then inside the property itself, it's just a little smart box. So that's not very obtrusive, quite a quick switch it in and out, not very disruptive to the people then living in the properties. So from the master developer perspective, somebody else's problem, they don't really have to worry about it. So sell it in the same way as you'd sell an HV substation for the master developer, because that's all they have to do. And then how they then sell that onto the house builder is when they come to do O&M in 30 years, again, it's all kind of local level stuff. They're not going to have to go and pester these poor little homeowners who've bought their properties and then redo their whole internal layout. That's been the biggest issue with some of the transitions from gas boilers to air source heat pumps and things that you always had your gas, but your water header tank in your cupboard, and now you've got a cupboard that's dead space in your floor plan, and what do you do with that? That problem doesn't exist anymore if you go for this sort of solution.
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth. So technology resilience is another element of this whole equation we've got to think about. Leah, I think you had one more question. I can take a really quick one. Are you happy to Otherwise, I'll wrap up because we're almost on time. Okay, well, happy to have a conversation separately, and I'm sure the panel members are. So I think that brings us roughly to time. Hopefully that was interesting, useful, gave you perspective to the kind of complexity of the challenge and the need to solve a lot of problems to bring forward these types of solutions. If you'd like to chat to Synergy and the team about the smart grids we offer, please feel free to do so. Some of the team is here, and we've got our stand over in Armories Hall. Please also then join me to thanking the panel. Really appreciate your time and your expertise. Thank you.